Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Managing DITA Implementation webcast. My name is Sarah O'Keefe. I'll be hosting today, and we have our Director of Operations here, Alan Pringle, who's going to be presenting this information. Welcome aboard. A couple of quick things before we get started. We are recording this webcast, and we will make it available within typically about 24 hours after the event, but give us some leeway for technical issues. We will take your questions toward the end of the webcast, so if you have those questions, please take a moment now to find the questions area in GoToWebinar. That's where we want you to drop in your questions, and we will answer those as we get into the Q&A time. So we're delighted to see you all here, and with that, I will turn it over to Alan. Alan, are you on the line?
I am.
Excellent.
Good morning.
Take it away, please.
Thank you. Good morning, or at least East Coast folks, good morning. I am Alan Pringle, Director of Publishing Operations here at Scriptorium. I help folks with content strategy analysis projects and with the implementation of new content processes. And a lot of those processes are often based on DITA. I am co-author of 3 books: Content Strategy 101, The State of Structured Authoring, and Technical Writing 101. Wanted to kick things off with a quick poll just to find out where everyone stands in regard to DITA implementation. So I'm going to post this poll and let me know if you are now just considering an implementation or in the middle of an implementation or have completed one or none of the above. So I'll give you a little while to answer that. Okay, it looks like most folks have voted, and 50% of folks on the webcast are considering an implementation, and 13% considering, and it just changed. 11% is in the midst of, and 33% has completed an implementation. So we have none of the above. So it sounds like everybody's either considering DITA or is actively engaged with it right now. There are some kind of overarching assumptions that I want to talk about before we start getting into the DITA implementation aspects. First of all, that you have done a content strategy analysis that has led you to DITA. A lot of people think, oh, DITA is cool, it's the next big thing, I need to do it. That's not a good enough reason to do it. You need to take a look at your company's business goals and figure out exactly what it is you need your content to do to help support those goals. And DITA, if it's a good fit, great. Go forward with an implementation. Something else that's also very important to think about is change management. You can have laid out the best plan in the world for a DITA implementation, but if you haven't thought about the consequences of that plan and how it affects people and communicating with folks and talking with them about those changes and what's to come, you're going to fail. So it's very important throughout your planning and implementation, even in follow-up phase, to always keep in mind change management. Sarah O'Keefe a few weeks ago did a blog post about content strategy and change management. And that story has links to several different articles and blog posts about change resistance and content strategy. If you want more information on this, you can take a look at that at tiny.cc change res, and you'll see those links there. It's some worthwhile reading there, and I do recommend it. So let's move forward and kind of look at the ways that you can keep your DITA 3-ring circus. And it often does feel like a 3-ring circus because you've got so many pieces and moving parts you have to manage. But you want to keep it from being one of those kind of circuses that has the scary clowns that pop up out of nowhere. So I'm going to give you a few tips and let you know about some of the things I've experienced to kind of help keep those scary clowns at bay, because I don't know about you, but I am not big on the scary clowns. So let's talk a little bit about what I'm going to cover. we're going to talk about wrangling people, content modeling, evaluating tools, outputs, and finally conversion, and then we'll also answer questions at the end. Now, wrangling people. Soft skills are essential for any project to succeed, and your DITA implementation is not going to be any different. So let's talk a little bit about that. Those of us in technical communication are really big on communicating with our audience at the right level. And we need to use those skills when we're working with all the different groups that are going to be involved in the DITA implementation. Good communication is the absolute key to managing change resistance, like I mentioned earlier. So there's going to be a little bit of change management kind of mingled in here with this people wrangling aspect of your project. You need to start your conversations very early. Even before you choose DITA, your content strategy analysis, you need to talk to all the different groups and start then. And then when you've got all your requirements from your content strategy, you've chosen DITA, and then now you're ready to implement, and the conversations need to keep happening. In my experience, we're usually called in at Scriptorium by the technical communication department to help. But we talk to a lot of different groups, and I'm going to run over a few of those different groups and give you an idea of, of these folks and what we say to them. Executives. These are the folks who basically are paying the way and have green-lit a project to go forward. In general, these folks don't want to hear all the gory details about the tool chain, about the NITO features that you've implemented for sharing and all that sort of stuff. With this group, it's generally better, I find, to talk about, we've got this percentage of the project complete. We're running into a little issue here. We're going to have some budget overage because of this, that sort of thing. You need to speak basically in metrics to executives. And I realize I am speaking in generalizations that are almost bordering on stereotypes here, but it is my experience that folks at the executive level don't want to be bothered with all the details. They want to know about the project, how well it's going, and if you're meeting your budget and your timelines. That is what is important to them. A very big group are your content creators and consumers, and really there are not enough lions in this photograph to represent all the different content creators and consumers in your organization. Good example of this is, how is your DITA workflow going to support engineers who both write little bits of content and review information? A fully featured authoring tool that is probably great for your full-time tech writer is likely overkill for your engineers. So how can you make creating the little bit of information that they write, how can you make that easier for them? You probably need to look at another tool, maybe a web-based form, something that is kind of strips down and focuses their efforts. Also, you need to look at the way that your content is created and formatted, and you need to get input from all the different consumers of that information. For example, your folks in customer support are a really, really good resource because, number one, they're internal users of your information. When they have calls from your customers, they may be using the TechCom docs to answer questions, and they can tell you, yeah, this is working for me, that's not. In addition to giving feedback on their own experience with the docs, they can also tell you what the customers are saying. I did not like the way that this doc did this, or I could not find this answer anywhere in this content. So really talk to your support folks because they're kind of like a dual resource. They can give you their opinions, on their own experience, and also summarize and kind of channel to you your external customers' experiences when you don't have the ability to talk to them directly yourself. Another group that's really important to talk to is your IT department, and they need to get in very early in your content strategy analysis. begin those conversations early, because if you're going to be implementing new tools, who is going to support those tools? You need an IT department, the IT department, to help you with that. This is particularly crucial if you're installing a component content management system to manage your DITA content. If your IT department does not have the resources to handle the installation and continued maintenance of a CCMS, then you're going to have to narrow your search to hosted solutions, because that way, if you're going with the hosted solution, the vendor is going to provide all the maintenance services for you. And that's a really important thing to think about, because you don't want to get stuck in a situation, and I have seen this happen, where you have an installed solution, yet you don't have the resources to fully maintain it, and it slows down and really hampers your implementation. So do stay in close contact with your IT department, and don't be afraid to ask for resource commitments from them either. Another group you need to talk to is your web team. This is if you're going to be shifting to HTML-based outputs. In my experience, when a lot of people shift to a DITA implementation, they are also thinking about the move from strictly PDF print and kind of opening things up and putting more stuff out on the web, or putting it in ebooks and things like that. If you're going to move that route when you are implementing DITA, you need to talk to your web team to get specifications and information about the architecture of your company's website. There are a whole lot of really neat things you can do with HTML5, for example, but it doesn't make any sense to architect this great big HTML5-based solution when it turns out that your customer base is using an older browser like Internet Explorer 7 that can't handle a lot of the new features of HTML5. So be sure you know from your web team what browsers they're targeting, what kind of navigation they're setting up, because you're going to have to fold all of that information into your specifications and your output for your HTML. And not to keep beating on the change management drum, it's really important when you're talking to all these different groups to remember during this implementation, people's jobs are changing. They're maybe getting more responsibility, having something taken away. Always keep that in mind when you're communicating with folks, because communication is going to be the best way to kind of put people at ease and to make things go smoothly. And it's really hard to overestimate the importance of good communication. It is just as essential as having a good technical understanding of DITA to a successful implementation. Now let's kind of move out of the more soft skill stuff and start talking about some more DITA-specific stuff. Talk a little bit about content modeling. One good exercise to start learning the DITA content model is to look at your legacy existing content and figure out how you can map the paragraphs and features in that content to DITA equivalents. You can even create a spreadsheet, list out all of your paragraph and character tags, and then in another column, list out what you think the DITA equivalent should be. And it's a good way to kind of stick your toe in the pool of the model and figure out what's going on. And it is a good way to kind of start that process of learning. But you need to be careful not to focus exclusively on the past, because your content, your legacy content, was likely not written with DITA in mind. I'm guessing if you're switching to DITA, you really weren't thinking about DITA best practices when you were writing your content originally. And it's probably not going to be, for example, modular in nature. And you know, DITA is very modular. Things are broken up into smaller chunks and then put back together to create your larger deliverables. So, you know, kind of strike a balance between, yes, we can map existing content to DITA elements versus sticking with exactly what you've got now, because it is probably not DITA ready, but it's a good starting point. Something else that's also really crucial in an implementation is figuring out how you're going to handle metadata. And metadata is data about your data. And what you can do with metadata with DITA, there are lots of things you can do. For example, you can use metadata to filter what content does and does not go into a final deliverable, such as a PDF file. Those of you in FrameMaker who are familiar with conditional text, there is a way to set that up with filtering by attribute values in DITA. You can also use attribute values which store metadata to narrow your searches for particular DITA source files. Say you want to figure out if someone's already written some information and you don't want to rewrite it, and you really need to narrow the focus, the scope of your search, particularly in a component content management system, excuse me. You can use the attributes and metadata values to really get a very specific search and narrow down what you're trying to find. You can also use metadata as processing instructions in your output. A good example of that is if you have context-sensitive help sets, you've got to have some way to hook a particular chunk of HTML to a feature on your GUI. And metadata, an ID, is a way that you can do that. You set up an ID that is basically creates the association or helps you create the association between a particular piece of HTML in your help set and a feature on your GUI. It's also important to realize in regard to metadata that metadata is not just attributes that hang off of elements. There are bits of metadata that hang off of your book map as actual elements. They are not attributes. You can track publication level information like your publication date, your version, your release, and all that sort of stuff with elements that are part of a book map. And for those of you who don't know much about what a book map is, it is basically the file that is a wrapper, the container for all of the DITA topics that you want to put together into a book, into a help set, an ebook, or whatever. Those of you who are familiar with FrameMaker, I would say the equivalent of a book map in DITA is a book file in FrameMaker. I want to talk a little bit about some ways that you can change the content model in DITA. One of those is through specialization. And this is when you're asking yourself, do I need to create a new element because the DITA model doesn't have it? You would create new elements by basing it on an existing element or attribute. Unless you have a really, really good understanding of existing content models and how DITA flows together, I would kind of recommend holding off on specializing unless you are absolutely positive that you need a new element. The reason why I recommend against it, especially for those who are not super familiar with the content model, is because it takes a lot of work, first of all, to set that specialization up just on the DITA side. There's a little bit of technical wizardry you have to do to get that set up. Not only do you have to do it on the DITA side, you have to be sure that your authoring tools support it, and you will also have to make changes in your component content management system as well. So there is this kind of cascading effect that occurs when you decide, yes, I need to specialize and create a new element set for my content. So be prepared to do a lot of work to create and maintain that specialization if you find it necessary. And I'm not saying that it is never the case that specialization is not necessary. There are very good business reasons for doing it, but you do need to balance the effort it takes to create that specialization and maintain it versus what it buys you in the content model. So you kind of have to weigh those two things. Another thing you can do with the DITA content model, this was introduced in DITA 1.2 specification. It's called constraining. You basically can hide certain sets of elements in DITA so your authors don't see them while they're working on content. And yes, there are tons and tons of tags in DITA, and if you can narrow down the number of tags for your authors, it can make life easier for them. So it is absolutely something to consider. caveats are kind of the same for constraining as it is for specialization. You really need to be sure you have a very thorough understanding of the DITA model before you start making those changes. So if you're still learning your way around, hold off on doing constraining. Once you start to get more comfortable and your authors and your groups start creating content, maybe they can help give you some feedback and say, you know what, we never use this stuff, let's think about hiding it. So you could wait, get some experience, and then constrain based on the results of your experience. Content modeling, from my point of view, is not just about elements and attributes. You also need to figure out how you're going to use a lot of the really interesting constructs that DITA offers that are particularly helpful for reuse. Some examples of these things are a conref. Conref allows you to insert a chunk of text instead of copying and pasting it over and over again. A good example of this is, say you have a note that is common across a product's content. Instead of copying, pasting, or retyping that note, you can reference it. It's kind of like a little text inset in FrameMaker. There's also another conref-related feature that was introduced in DITA 1.2 called conref push. And I'll admit it took me a little while to figure out conref push, but I did it with some help from an article that Kristen James Eberlein published. You can read it at tiny.cc conref push. In essence, conref push will allow you to insert an element into a topic. A good example of this is, suppose you've got two products that share a procedure, except one of those products has an additional step in there that you need to add in. Instead of duplicating that topic and inserting that specific procedure, what you can do is basically set up a pointer where it will pull it in for the particular model where you need it. Yes, my explanation was not great, I admit, but do take a look at Kristen James Eberlein's article because I think that is a very useful feature, and I do recommend checking that out. Another feature worth looking into are keywords. Keywords are essentially what I would call a document level variable. A good example of that is if you've got a product name that occurs all across your content, or even your company name, you can set that up as a keyword and then reference it throughout your document set. One way that would be very handy to have your company name in a keyword is if in the future you have any acquisitions or your company changes names. Having that company name set up where you just have to change it that one time where you've defined it means you don't have to go through your documents and your source files and find every reference to the company name. You set it up as a keyword, you change it there, and you're done. So that's a handy reuse item as well. So do think about elements, attributes, and all the DITA constructs when you're setting up your content model for DITA. I want to move now on to evaluating tools. I want to start off by mentioning choosing a tool is not a content strategy. And it's also true to say choosing a tool that supports DITA does not mean you have a DITA strategy. So don't fall in the trap of thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to pick DITA, I've got the tool, I'm done. You're not going to get a lot of success with that kind of thinking. One big challenge I find in particular with tools and evaluating them is what I call tool myopia. That is where the tool that you're using now, and this is particularly true of an authoring tool used by the TechCon group, people are very focused on that tool. They use it every day. They like it. It makes their life easier. Because they've used it so long, they may use it as a way to gauge what tools that you're going to use for DITA should and should not do. And that's a really dangerous thing because your current workflow should not be the benchmark for your new DITA workflow. One way to kind of treat this illness, if you want to call it that, is to develop requirements for your tools and look way beyond what you're doing now. Your legacy tool, yes, it may have some features that are very useful, and it may do some things that you need to find the equivalent for in DITA, but don't let that be the end-all be-all of how you evaluate tools for your new process. When you're compiling those requirements, you can use those to score vendors. You can create a spreadsheet and list out your requirements and pass those on to your vendors and get feedback from them on how well they handle all of your requirements. You can also create, for your own purposes, a weighted spreadsheet. So if you've got some features that are really important, more versus some that are kind of nice to have, in that weighted spreadsheet, you can set it up. So if a particular tool does very well for those required features, it will get a higher ranking when everything is added up than a tool that focuses just mostly and does well on the nice-to-have features. It's also worth noting that when you're developing your requirements and you're passing them on to your vendors, you don't have to set things up so they're just binary, yes, no, I do or I do not support this particular feature or requirement. You could, for example, create short narratives that explain a specific use case for your company and ask that the vendor give you a narrative response that explains how the tool that they are selling could handle your specific scenario. That is, I think, really going to help you get a fuller picture than just binary yes, no kinds of questions that you could have in a spreadsheet. When you are talking to the different vendors, ask very specific questions about how they support DITA features. For example, how do you handle DITA-val files? How do you handle conref? How do you handle keywords? Do you support all of these features? Really ask those questions point blank. And in some cases you'll hear, well, we don't exactly do that, but we do have a similar feature. Well, when you start hearing things like that, your antennas should go up. You want to be sure that you were getting full DITA support and not some kind of custom proprietary support that will be difficult to break away from later. If you feel uncomfortable about the answers you're hearing about how a tool supports DITA, there's a good chance your relationship with that vendor, if you move forward, may not get much better. So when you start to get a little antsy, do pay attention to that, because there's a good chance things won't get better down the road. I kind of already touched on this, but I think it's very important, particularly when you're looking at component content management systems, to be sure you have an escape hatch in mind. How would you extract information from a CCMS and import it into a new system when you either outgrow it, find it's not supporting you like it should be, or for whatever reason? You need a way to get your content out and into another system. So do think about that and ask those kinds of questions when you are evaluating CCMS systems. You really want to be sure that you have a way to get your stuff out cleanly and into another system. When you are evaluating and vetting tools, I do recommend that you get help, if at all possible, from a third-party consultant, especially an experienced consultant. And yes, I have to disclose, we are consultants here at Scriptorium. We do this kind of work. So I am a little biased there, I'll admit. But if you're about to spend, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on a CMS, you really might want to get some help from folks who have used those systems, worked with the vendors, and has a good idea of what fits well for certain customer requirements. So I do recommend, if at all possible, when you were starting to look at budgets for your DITA implementation to consider getting budgets to help you vet tools during your tool evaluation process. Another plus, too, of having a third party in there to help you evaluate is that if anybody needs to play a bad cop, let the consultant do it so you don't have to do it. I want to talk a little bit about outputs that you get, especially from the DITA Open Toolkit right now. Originally, I was going to do a poll to ask people to give their impressions of the output that they may have seen from the DITA Open Toolkit, and I decided against it because the stuff is ugly, and I want to try to keep this presentation fairly PG-13 rated, and I don't want people using colorful language to describe of what comes out by default from the DITA Open Toolkit. I've got up on the screen right now an example of what you do get from the default PDF output from the DITA Open Toolkit. This is the first page of a chapter from Sarah O'Keefe in my Content Strategy 101 book. I think it's fair to say it's not super attractive. And if you look at a page that's not the start of a chapter, it's even less attractive. You'll notice that this, by the way, is an 8.5 by 11 page, and the text goes all the way across. So that's a lot for someone to have to read. It's a sea of gray. I think it's also worth pointing out, if you'll look down toward like the last third of the page, the heading for the business case topic, which includes that Table 9 estimated cost, that business case heading is the same size as the figure caption above it. It is the same size as the table caption above it. So it's very hard to see a hierarchy the way that this is laid out visually. This is an example of that same exact content in our custom PDF plugin that we use to create a 7 by 9 page, and we submitted this PDF to our printer. So what you're looking at right here is the first page of a chapter from the PDF that we sent to the printer for the print edition of Content Strategy 101. You'll notice that it's a little more spread out. The fonts are a little more attractive. Your line spacing is a little easier to handle. I think it's more attractive. And here is another page out of that book just to show you that business case heading and how we kind of jack the size up. So there is a clear delineator. This is the start of a new section. We also cleaned up the table design a little bit to make it a little more readable as well. So it is possible to fix the default output you get from the DITA OT, which as you saw, it is quite ugly, and it is a very basic starting point. When you're looking at your outputs, I recommend taking a software development approach. List out your requirements for your outputs, PDF, HTML, whatever it may be. Once again, spreadsheets can be your friend here too. If you were trying to emulate existing formatting, say in a FrameMaker or Word template, what you can do is take the specifications for the different styles and tags in your template and break them out into that spreadsheet. You know, a heading 1 is this font. It's 36-point bold. It's got line spacing of this. All that sort of information. Break that out into that spreadsheet, because when you have all that stuff very detailed and specific in that spreadsheet, it is going to make your programmer, your XSL transform programmer who is going to work on your plugins, it's going to make their life a lot easier, and the process is going to go much more smoothly if they have that all laid out for them. Something else that's worth mentioning, this is in regard to PDF output, is the Apache FOP FO processor that comes with the DITA Open Toolkit. The FOP processor really it doesn't fully support all of the requirements and specifications of the FO specification. And by the way, FO stands for formatting objects. Formatting objects is a markup language that formats your XML content for output to PDF. So basically, you run your DITA XML through one of these processors, and it will create your PDF. The problem with the FOP processor, which is free and open source, is that it doesn't support some fairly important features. A few that come to mind are, for example, change bars. There are also keep together settings where, for example, you can keep the first paragraph of a section with its heading. There are settings to kind of tie those things together. There is not full support for those keep with settings and keep together settings through FOP, even though the FO spec has laid out a lot of those different kind of keep with settings. It's also worth noting that FOP does not support open type fonts. That's a huge problem if the fonts you want to use are of the open type variety. To get around this lack of support in FOP, I strongly recommend that you look into licensing a professional rendering tool for PDF, such as Antenna House. The Antenna House formatter, it more fully implements the FO standard, and it also offers you some extensions that will give you a lot of control over the look and feel of your PDF file. The examples that I showed you earlier of our pages from from Content Strategy 101, that PDF came from Antenna House. So definitely think about that when you're doing your budgeting. You really want to probably look into adding the cost of a professional FO rendering tool. To get more details on what the open source Apache FOP does and does not support, go to tiny.cc flop, and you will see a lot of tables that will explain, and in great detail I might add, what that particular FO renderer can and cannot do. This may come no surprise to you, but you're going to need a lot of money if you're going to be modifying the default plugins. I would say a good PDF plugin is probably going to run you $12,000 or more. Transforms for web pages, ebooks, other HTML-based formats may run less, but it really depends on how complex they are. Even if you have someone in your organization that has the skills to work on the transforms for PDF and your HTML-based outputs, you're still going to have to block off that person's time, and that's an expense as well. So be sure when you're doing your budget calculations, keep in mind you're going to spend quite a bit of money on those plugins. The good thing is with the plugins, once they're done and configured, that's pretty much it. They're going to run the same way every time. Now, you may want to have a little money tucked away to help you fix small things that you want to change down the road. That's a very good idea. So you might want to add a little bit of support to help get modifications done by a vendor, especially if you have outsourced your plugin work. And if you are using your in-house resources, you need to budget for that time for doing any fixes down the road as well. I want to talk a little bit about conversion too. Before you get started converting, I highly recommend you research best practices for the DITA model before you proceed. You can read the DITA spec all day long, and it is not going to give you subjective advice on how the best ways to implement all the different elements and features in DITA. You need a third-party reference for that. A good one to consider is the DITA Style Guide by Tony Self. And I have to confess, Scriptorium did publish that book Even so, I have found it immensely helpful when working with clients to figure out the best ways to apply the DITA model to their content. You don't have to use Tony's book, but I do recommend that you do find a book that covers best practices, read it to get a better understanding before you start to convert your content. In some cases, when you're looking at your legacy content that's in your old tool, FrameMaker, Word, whatever it may be, when you look at that content, you may end up deciding that you're better off just starting over. If your content is not consistently formatted, you are not following a template in the content, there are a lot of one-off formats, that is going to make automated conversion basically impossible. Another aspect you need to look at is if your content cannot be easily broken into modules, which is what you need to do because DITA is a modular approach to content, you may be better off starting over, kind of outlining, sketching out the modules to explain your particular product, and there may be bits of information that you can use in your legacy content. There are some authoring tools, XML authoring tools, that are pretty good about taking information that you copy and paste from, say, for example, a Word document, paste it into that editor, and it will wrap that content and make its best guess, if you will, about the DITA elements that it should be. I've had some pretty good experience or experiment results with Oxygen where I've copied and pasted Word content into the Oxygen editor, and it did a pretty good job of wrapping that content in the correct DITA elements. So even if you're decided that you're going to start over from scratch and begin writing really without any conversion involved, you still can borrow bits and pieces from your legacy content with that cut and paste method if your editor supports it. Even if you decide that you don't need to do any conversion, you're going to kind of leave your legacy content behind, you still are going to need content to test your content model and the transforms for PDF, HTML, and whatever else. You need to create what I like to call a greatest hits collection of DITA files that represents the real-world content you're going to be creating and distributing. So create 50 to 100 pages of content that's based on your real-world stuff, and then string it together in a bookmap file and use it to test your transforms. The DITA Open Toolkit does offer some sample files, but they're very, very basic, and they do not show really good examples of all the different neat features that you can do with conref keywords and all that kind of stuff. So I do recommend setting up files, and be sure you cover all the different topic types. You can have a task topic, a concept topic, reference topic, and even a generic topic. Find information in your content that matches all of those topic types. Create topics with that information in it. Implement some keywords, implement some conrefs, and then run that content through your transforms to be sure you're getting from those transforms what you really need. It's really important to give yourself a lot of time to do a conversion. I have now worked on lots of conversion projects, and there has always been some stumbling block that has occurred. So be prepared to deal with some surprises in your content. You'll find out that a certain set of documents didn't follow the template like you thought that they did. Things like that. There are always going to be some little things lurking in your content. If you give yourself enough time to do your conversion, you can account for and handle those little emergencies as they occur. So do be ready for unpleasant surprises, because I pretty much guarantee they will occur. A few weeks ago, I wrote a blog post, and one of the most important points that I made in that blog post was valid DITA and good DITA are not the same thing. And here is the URL for that blog post. Check it out if you get a chance. tiny.cc 5 DITA tips. You could, for example, write a procedure in a generic DITA topic and use an ordered list, list items for all the steps in your procedure. Technically, that is valid DITA. You could do that. However, the correct way from the DITA point of view of handling that is to create a task topic that has all of the step elements set up to handle every step in your procedure. The reason why it's important to go the good DITA route, especially in this case, is because the transform that creates the formatting for the procedure may depend on having that content in a task element. If that content is not in a generic topic element and it's set up as just ordinary LIs in an ordered list, your output will not look correct for that procedure. So be sure that you kind of understand the difference between valid DITA, which there are tools, your authoring tool will tell you this content is valid. What it probably won't tell you, however, is if it is, quote, good DITA. And that's where you need to research your best practices, get a copy of the DITA style guide, talk to some people who have implemented before, and get that kind of guidance on what works best. If you have any questions about a DITA implementation, please contact me. You can reach me at asp@scriptorium.com. You can also reach me at Twitter at Alan Pringle. Got a list of resources there for you for DITA. Scriptorium's blog, we write a whole lot about DITA implementations. The first 4 URLs that I have listed there, change, conref, push, FOP deficiency, and conversion. We've already talked about those, but I wanted to kind of compile those for you. Also wanted to point to a blog post on DITA skills I wrote a few months ago that kind of gives you the idea of the skills you'll need to kind of transform yourself from a tech writer to a DITA technologist. Also want to point you to a webcast recording of Sarah O'Keefe. Last year she did a webcast called DITA 101 that gives a very basic overview of DITA. You may not need it yourself, but it could be helpful to explain to an executive, for example, what DITA is and how it can help your company. So if you know anybody who needs kind of a basic introduction to DITA, that's a good place to start. Also mentioned the DITA Style Guide by Tony Self. Yes, I published it, but it's a great book. I do recommend it. Also, if you're looking in, just starting to get with the idea of DITA and you're still working out your content strategy, check out Content Strategy 101. You can read the entire book online for free at contentstrategy101.com. And now I will take any questions or comments you may have.
Hey, Alan, a couple of things coming in. And for those of you that are on the webcast live, do drop in your questions into the questions tab. We've got about 10 minutes to deal with those. So one of the questions that's kind of out there is what is the biggest mistake that you see people make? The one thing when people are getting started that you'd really like to tell them, don't do that, or do that, I guess.
I think you really need to get an understanding of the best practices of DITA. Get yourself a good third-party reference, like the DITA Style Guide. I know I keep mentioning that book, but it's a good one, because there is so much in the content model for DITA, and it is overwhelming sometimes trying to figure out, first of all, just the elements that you're going to use, much less how you're going to do attributes instead of all the special features like conrefs, keyrefs, and all that sort of stuff. Get a third-party reference and read it to help kind of narrow your focus and give you some real-world advice from people who are DITA practitioners. I think that is a very important first step that some people sometimes skip. The DITA spec, it is very helpful, but it is not enough to give you the kind of advice you need to get started.
Okay. What about localization? How does that affect your planning or your implementation?
When you were starting to do even your content strategy that precedes a DITA implementation, you need to be talking to your localization folks, absolutely. One big thing to keep in mind, there are lots of reuse mechanisms in DITA, and there are ways that you can do reuse down to even the phrase level, just a few words. While DITA technically supports reuse, at that very discrete level of just a few words in a sentence, that doesn't work so well in the world of localization, and it will make localization much more difficult. So, you need to think about how those reuse mechanisms, how it's going to have an impact on your localization, and you might want to, example, stick to just paragraph level instead of going phrase level, because it does increase the complexity of your localization.
And I think we have one last question, which I guess ties into the question about the mistakes, which is what's the most surprising thing that you find as you get into these implementations and as things are moving around?
I think for me, having worked on several of these implementations, it's always great when all the puzzle pieces click in someone's mind and they see how DITA's modular approach can really help them. It really varies from person to person, but I have seen this happen with several different people where they say, oh wow, now I get it, and I see how all these pieces fit together. When that happens, that's really rewarding, and that's when people understand that what they've done has not been in vain. So to me, that's the really pleasant surprise.
Okay, and I think with that we will wrap things up here. Any parting words of wisdom?
Take a deep breath. You'll be okay.
Okay. Oh, I do have another question that just popped in at the last minute here. Can you create different outputs from DITA, including PDF and HTML? Is HTML through transforms?
Yes. There are different types of transforms, but you can create them both. Yes.
Along with other kinds of formats as needed.
Right. You can create many. You are not limited to just what the DITA Open Toolkit offers you. There are lots of other things that you can do. So you can create multiple transforms to handle all the different outputs.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you for doing this presentation, and thank you to all the participants for being here. We'll try and have the recording up not too long from now. And of course, if you have other questions, feel free to ping us. Thanks again.